Hello and welcome to this recording of my ideas on Act 4, Scene 1 of Othello. As you're listening, make sure you're using a note-taking sheet, so there's an example on the side of the screen here that you could use as a template. Okay, so what's happened in the play already? Well, we've seen the exposition in Act 1 where Shakespeare establishes Othello's nobility against a background of xenophobia. And although that doesn't justify his actions towards the end of the play, it perhaps explains why Othello feels so self-conscious about his marriage and why he believes Iago's accusations against Desdemona so readily. So in the exposition, Iago and Rodrigo tell Brabantio about the elopement. Iago manipulates Rodrigo but presents an honest face to Othello. We've also seen the rising action, which reveals how Othello's insecurities are exploited, and that destabilises the precarious balance of love, marriage and social order. At the start of Act 2, Othello's attitude to love is transcendent. He talks about Desdemona being his soul's joy, and it really seems a very elevated attitude to love, which changes radically as we progress through the scene and into Act 3 and 4. So the storm at the start of Act 2 destroys the Turkish fleet and symbolises the chaos that's entering into the play. The feast is announced and Cassio is then demoted, and then Cassio tries to speak to Desdemona alone, and Iago starts to use this to his advantage. At the climax of the play, we see deception and duplicity dominate, while the destructive power of jealousy becomes clear. So Othello and Desdemona argue about the handkerchief and about Cassio. Unbeknownst to them, Cassio has found the handkerchief and has given it to the courtesan Bianca. Othello then sees Bianca with the handkerchief and takes this as proof of Desdemona's infidelity, and in the scene that we're going to look at today, he then strikes Desdemona. So this is the first sign of physical violence in the play, and foreshadows what is to come later on. And then we're entering really the falling action here, where we have a combination of Othello's increasing corruption and Iago's lust for power, and together these aspects of the play plunge society into chaos and disorder. So what is really a personal tragedy ripples out into the political and social sphere. Finally, the denouement of the play, we see the debasement of previously honourable emotions is irreversible, whilst others proceed to attempt to restore order and justice. Okay, so Act 4, Scene 1, what happens then? So at the start, Iago and Othello enter. Iago is tormenting Othello with thoughts of Desdemona and Cassio's infidelity, with references to the handkerchief. And Iago tells Othello that Cassio has said that he slept with Desdemona. Iago still pretends that he's reluctant to give these details, so he tantalises Othello with little snippets of information, forcing Othello to ask many questions about the specifics of what's actually happened. And in doing so, Iago winds Othello up into a fury. Othello's language then completely breaks down. He becomes violent and irrational, and he falls into a trance. And we usually interpret this as a state similar to an epileptic fit, given Iago's description of it in the scene. Cassio enters as Iago pretends to be worried about Othello's health. Cassio leaves, with Iago saying they must have a conversation later, and this is Iago stage managing the scene as well. He's placing the characters in the locations that he wants them to be so that they can fall in line with his plan. Othello then awakens in a state of great anger, and Iago tells him to hide where he can overhear the conversation that he's going to have with Cassio. So Othello follows Iago's directions. Cassio re-enters. Iago starts talking to Cassio about Bianca, but he says the courtesan's name very quietly so that Othello will believe that the conversation's about Desdemona. Cassio speaks very callously and dismissively about Bianca, openly admitting their relationship and saying that she follows him everywhere, that she loves him, that she's talking about marrying him, and we'll look at Bianca's character later in this video. Bianca then enters and, absolutely enraged, asks Cassio about the handkerchief. She clearly doesn't believe Cassio's insistence that he find it lying in his room. Bianca then leaves and Cassio follows in order to calm her down. Now, of course, all of this is evidence for Othello, from his point of view, that Cassio's had an affair with Desdemona. But the audience, through use of dramatic irony, is aware that actually Iago is manipulating the situation and Desdemona has nothing to do with Cassio and Bianca's relationship. So Othello emerges from his hiding place and Iago consolidates his deception, reminding Othello that Bianca had the handkerchief and twisting Cassio's words further so they sound as if they were about Desdemona. Othello's language again becomes increasingly violent and he cries, "I will chop her into messes." Then he asks for poison. At this point, Iago suggests it be more appropriate to strangle her in the marriage bed, and Othello agrees to do this. So this is a really crucial moment of the play where the future is decided. Othello and Iago hatch their plan and all that remains is for that plan to fall into place. At that point, Lodovico and Desdemona arrive. Now, we haven't seen Lodovico for a couple of acts. He was one of the people at the top of the social hierarchy in Venice, and he is often the voice of order and reason in the play. He's been sent from Venice to Cyprus by the Duke because he has a letter for Othello. Given that he's not seen the gradual decline of Othello's state of mind, his reaction to the general's actions is crucial in helping the audience to understand just how far Othello has fallen. Lodovico gives Othello the letter, which commands him to return to Venice, leaving Cassio in his place as governor of Cyprus. Obviously, the hierarchy in Venice aren't aware of the disagreement that's gone on between Cassio and Othello. Lodovico asks Desdemona how Cassio is doing, and as she replies, Othello clearly misinterprets this. He strikes her and he calls her devil. Lodovico's astonishment at this act of unprovoked violence is designed to guide the audience's reaction. Othello has now progressed from verbal to physical violence. Othello then denounces Desdemona in public and commands her to leave. He says Cassio shall have my place. The double meaning here is that Cassio will take over as governor, and also that he'll take Othello's place with Desdemona in the marriage bed. As Othello exits, Lodovico and Iago discussed how changed he is since he left Venice. Okay, so looking a bit more closely at the language in this scene then, here are the lines that precede Othello's epileptic fit. So he says, "Lie with her, lie on her. We say lie on her when they belie her. Lie with her, that's fulsome. Handkerchief, confessions, handkerchief. To confess and be hanged for his labour. First to be hanged and then to confess. I tremble at it. Nature would not invest herself in such shadowing passion without some instruction. It is not words that shake me thus. Pish, noses, ears and lips. Is it possible? Confess, handkerchief, O devil." So here we see that Iago provokes Othello into a state of intense emotional distress. As well as the fury of his expression, it is important to note how Othello's language has changed since the eloquent, measured speeches of Act 1. So in Act 1 we saw him saying, for example, "Rude am I in my speech," as in, I'm not very good at speaking in public, and then proceeding to very eloquently explain his relationship with Desdemona and how much he loves her. And of course we've already mentioned the phrase "oh my soul's joy" in this video. But here what we've got is a repetition of key words, so they reveal his obsession with infidelity. So we have lie, we have handkerchief. And the double meaning of lie is important, so we have the sexual interpretation, but also the idea that an untruth is being told. And the handkerchief, which was a symbol of their love and the loyalty in their marriage, has now become a symbol of betrayal for Othello. We also have a shift from blank verse to prose. So blank verse is where we have iambic pentameter, as in 5 pairs of syllables in the line, the pattern of which goes to dum to dum. So we have an unstressed syllable and then a stressed syllable. And in a lot of the play we've seen them use blank verse. Now here we have very chaotic, unmetrical language. There's no regular rhythm and there's no regular number of syllables in every line. And this is a signal to us that Othello is descending into madness. Now the other character who uses prose in the play is Iago, and we saw him talk in prose in Act 1. So what we also have is a convergence of Othello's language with Iago's language. As they become closer, Othello's language converges or becomes more similar to Iago's language. Now we also have some crude imagery in this extract. So previously he spoke of Desdemona as his soul's joy, and here his language is very debased and repulsive, again similar to Iago's language. We have a semantic field of violence and debased imagery, which we'll look at on the next slide. The epileptic fit also symbolises the complete loss of rational thought and Othello's degradation. The sight of the tragic hero foaming at the mouth and in a savage madness indicates how far he has fallen from his insistence on his nobility and achievements in Act 1. And here Iago is supremely in control, with the warrior Othello lying vulnerable at his feet. Okay, so linguistic convergence then. This is when an individual's language changes to resemble that of another person. It's usually as a result of prolonged contact and emotional closeness. So, Othello in Act 4, Scene 1. Well, we see him say zounds, we see him say pish. Both of those are swear words at the time. He talks about noses, ears and lips, so he's becoming obsessed with bodies rather than with transcendent or higher thoughts, as he was in when he said, "My soul's joy." He talks about monsters, beasts, bloody, dog. He says, "Let her rot and perish and be damned." Cuckold me means that he's been cheated on. And he describes Desdemona as a devil. Now, all of these phrases are really debased, they're sexual, they're not focused on any of the higher thoughts, but Iago has really dragged Othello's down to his level. In contrast, in Act 1, Scene 2 and Act 1, Scene 3, he's talked about Desdemona as being gentle, he's talked about his perfect soul, he calls the senators worthy, potent, grave and reverend. He talks to the Duke as your gracious patience. He refers to Desdemona as the lady, this fair lady, my wife. So all of those words in the first act are really clearly very different from the type of language that he's using in Act 4. And if we look at why this change has happened, let's dig down into Iago's words a little bit more. So one of the first things that Iago says to Othello in Act 1 is, "I had thought to have yerked him," as in I thought to stab Rodrigo. He talks about scurvy, using it as a derogatory term. He says by Janus, vicious, plague, filches, the meat it feeds on, cuckold, and damned. So the words that Iago has used with Othello have gradually changed Othello's mind from the very transcendent thoughts of Act 1 to the debased thoughts of Act 4. Looking at one of the quotations then that Othello says in Act 4, he says, "Oh, it comes over my memory, as doth the raven over the infectious house, boding to all, he had my handkerchief." Okay, so the infectious house is presumably an allusion to the plague or to disease that would have been prevalent in England at the time. And the raven was perceived as a harbinger of doom, as a bringer of bad luck or death. And here the raven symbolises the doom which is approaching Othello's mind and his marriage. And it reinforces his loss of control. He believes that fate, rather than an individual's choice, is now dominant. The motif of infection and disease adds to that, and it resonates throughout the play as a whole range of connotations. So disease at the time, particularly if we're thinking about the plague, would have been perceived as being uncontrollable. So these thoughts that are occurring in Othello's mind are completely beyond his ability to stop. The disease would also have shown the power of nature over mankind, which again would have echoed the symbolism of the storm in Act 2. Sometimes disease was interpreted as a punishment from God for somebody's sinful actions, and so Othello might be using this phrase as he thinks that Desdemona has really challenged God by sleeping with Cassio. Disease was also easily spread, and Othello's increasingly unstable mind results in chaos spreading throughout the whole society, so we see that in the fight in Act 2. And the continual references to the handkerchief in this scene attest to Othello's absolute obsession with it as a symbol of Desdemona's infidelity. So for the audience, it might seem like really flimsy evidence. Some commentators have said that Othello kills her just because of a handkerchief, and it's such a petty thing to commit such a horrific crime for. However, perhaps Shakespeare intended it to seem this way in order to remind us that the seeds of destruction are already sown in Act 1. The handkerchief is just a token, a catalyst really, for ideas that were already deeply embedded in Othello's mind at the very outset of the play. So at the start of the play, we see Othello's self-consciousness. I've mentioned this quote already, rude am I in my speech, as in his feeling that he's not well educated, he's not very good at speaking in public. In Act 1, we've seen Brabantio's very outspoken racism, and we've also seen Othello's lack of knowledge of his new wife. And these all play a part in prompting Othello to doubt Desdemona's loyalty. It's as if Othello has absorbed the racist preconceptions of those around him and has now started to believe them. Whereas at the start he would have challenged them, and he talks about his perfect soul. He says, I have done the state some service, as in I've fought well in the army and now they owe me something. Whereas now he starts to think, actually, perhaps everything that they've said about me is actually true. And so for Othello, the logical conclusion is that Desdemona will tire of him in favour of Cassio. And in this way, Shakespeare examines the impact that society's prejudices can have on the individual, on someone who has been isolated within a very racist society. Here we have a quotation from Iago. Now, this is when Othello has fallen into the epileptic fit and Iago is watching him, and this is before Cassio comes into the scene. So the reference to medicine juxtaposed is clearly with Othello's references to poison and disease elsewhere in the play. However, Iago's use of the word medicine is quite paradoxical, because he perceives his actions to have positive connotations, whereas actually from the audience's perspective, what Iago is doing is actually poisonous, and it's destroying Othello's mind. In terms of the staging of these lines, and don't forget you can speak about staging as well when you write your essays on this play, in terms of the staging, we see Iago standing above Othello, and Othello lying on the ground having this epileptic fit. So visually, Iago is dominant and in control of this scene. As soon as Cassio enters, Iago's attitude changes dramatically as he pretends to have compassion for Othello rather than mocking him. Also remember when you write your essays that you need to be linking different sections of the play together to show your knowledge of the whole text. And in terms of the staging, you might think back to Act 1, Scene 1, where Brabantio was higher up on the balcony and Iago was low down on the stage. And we've got a complete reversal of that power hierarchy at this point in the play. Now, this is a quotation from Othello, and he says this while he's hiding and listening to Cassio's conversation with Bianca. And he says, let her, so let Desdemona, rot and perish and be damned tonight, for she shall not live. No, my heart is turned to stone. I strike it and it hurts my hand. So the imagery of rot and perishing is obviously completely repellent, and so we see the continuation of Othello's use of debased and destructive language. Perish could perhaps be a biblical allusion, particularly if we link it with the adjective damned, and they could perhaps together refer to John 3:16, but they could be turning that verse on its head. In that particular verse, it says we shall not perish but have eternal life, meaning that if you follow God you will go to heaven, and rather than perishing in hell. But Othello seems to want to damn Desdemona, to condemn her to perish, to burn in hell. He seems to think that that would be a fitting punishment for what she's done. We also have in this extract a continued use of prose instead of blank verse, and we've already talked about that in this video. And then here at the end we see Othello describing his heart as being stone. His love is turned into hate, and here Shakespeare is showing just how fickle human emotion can be, and how that can lead to a personal tragedy. The image of striking his stony heart reveals that Othello is prepared to hurt himself in hurting Desdemona, which again foreshadows what's going to happen in Act 5 of the play. Now let's look at a couple of characters that we haven't talked about very much, minor characters in the play. However, there could be exam questions on these characters, so you need to make sure that you know these characters as well as the main characters of the play. So Bianca is a powerless courtesan within this very hierarchical, patriarchal world. And when we see her in this scene, she's filled with a righteous anger. Now, her name means white, which indicates that she is genuine in her love for Cassio. And unlike Othello's rage at Desdemona, Bianca's anger is shown to be justified. Cassio talks about her very disparagingly, and there is clearly something very strange about his possession of the handkerchief. So really Bianca provides a character foil or a contrast with Othello at this point in the play. Her name also indicates that she's an innocent victim of society because of the lack of opportunities for women to earn their own living, and perhaps her lack of family, we assume, to support her. She's forced into a particular line of work that means that she's going to be treated increasingly badly throughout the play. Saying that, she's exploited and marginalised, particularly by Cassio. And in this scene, Cassio refers to Bianca using a number of derogatory terms. So he calls her a caitiff, which means a wretch, a customer, calling her a prostitute, and a fichu, which means a polecat. Obviously there we have animalistic language that we've seen elsewhere in the play. And we see a different side to Cassio here as well. He's talked about Desdemona earlier on in the most elevated terms, saying that she's exquisite, but here we see him referring to Bianca, a lower class woman, using these insults really, and so we might perhaps question whether actually what Cassio said about Desdemona is genuine, or whether, like all the other characters in the play, Cassio has another darker side to him, whether he actually has a similar level of misogyny to what Iago shows. Amelia's character also reveals the vulnerability of a woman's status in a patriarchal society, and this leads us to the next point about how she's a mirror for Desdemona and Amelia. So Bianca is extremely vulnerable. Without the favour of the men in the play, she has no income, and at the time her history of prostitution would have rendered her unmarriageable, so she has to continue in this line of work or she won't survive. So therefore her anger at Cassio is drawing her into a very dangerous situation. If she loses his favour, then she loses her way of life as well. And Bianca's character is used to reflect how helpless women are without men in this world. Their stability, their financial security comes from the people that they're married to or the people that they have a relationship with. And this suggests what the possible future could be for Desdemona if she completely loses Othello's love. And Lodovico as well is a significant character in this scene. He's often the voice of reason, the voice of order in the play, and when he comes on the stage and witnesses Othello's violence towards Desdemona, he's very unsettled. He asks, "Is this the nature whom passion could not shake?" So what he's saying there is that in Venice, at the start of the play, lots of people respected Othello for the fact that he was very rational, that he didn't let emotion control his decisions and his actions. Actually, what we've seen in the play, but Lodovico didn't witness this, is that when Othello challenges Cassio about the fight, that he starts to feel that his mind is being overtaken by emotion, and that increasingly develops throughout the play. Othello increasingly gives in to his emotion during the text. Lodovico's function within this scene is really to provide an objective commentary on the radical transformation in Othello's character. So, as I say, he's missed all of Act 2 and he's missed all of Act 3 and comes in at the start of Act 4 and reminds the audience just what Othello should be, what our expectation of Othello is, and how shocking that change is. Lodovico is also sympathetic and honourable. He tries to guide Othello into the right course of action, only for his suggestions to be rejected by the tragic hero. So after Othello strikes Desdemona, Lodovico says, "Call the lady back," as in call her back so that you can apologise to her. And this provides a really stark contrast to the animalistic and derogatory language used to describe women elsewhere in the scene. So really, Lodovico is a role model for correct behaviour, thus emphasising the monstrosity of Othello's actions. Lodovico also represents the power of the social hierarchy, so the reason he's arrived in Cyprus is to give Othello the letter recalling him to Venice and to promote Cassio to governor of Cyprus. So Lodovico therefore reminds us of the social structure from Act 1, a structure which has allowed Othello to rise through the ranks, but has treated him with implicit and at times explicit racism. Okay, so end of Act 4, Scene 1 then. Let's look forward to what's coming next in the play. At the prompting of Iago, Othello has decided that Desdemona will die. Her fate has been determined. Iago has guided Othello to the means of death. So he's changed him from wanting to use poison to thinking about strangulation in the marriage bed. With this subsequent action of the plays all pointing towards this tragic outcome. And so what Shakespeare is going to do now in the following scenes is concentrate on developing an increasing level of empathy for Desdemona, who, once so determined and self-possessed, accepts her fate. Thank you very much for listening, and make sure you finish your notes off as well, and save this video so that you can come back to it later when you revise.